Hello and welcome everyone to the Autistic Project Manager. That's me, Susanne Moore, and we're going to talk about neurodiversity as a project management superpower. So unlocking those autistic strengths, and being autistic myself, I wanted to talk today about why some interviews don't work. And in my experience, most of the interviews that I have been involved with haven't worked for me. That is where I'm being interviewed for a role. Where I'm interviewing someone, that's a whole different story. But when I'm being interviewed, that often doesn't work. And some of the reasons it doesn't work, I think, is that some behavioural interviewing techniques actually bias people who are autistic. So a lot of that standardised stuff that people will ask is actually not helping us at all. And I can tell you one of the things that really doesn't help me, that really upsets me, is when I've had one or two interviews and I've managed to get through them, and then they want me to do one of those behavioural exercises. And whilst I'm actually not stupid, I'm quite intelligent, what happens to me in those sessions is that I tend to get stuck on questions that are ambiguous or don't make sense or are not logical. So instead of just moving on, I start thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. They shouldn't have asked it that way. And that's actually not what they're asking. And I've learned that over time, that when someone asks you a question, it's not necessarily the answer that I would give, which is usually the absolute fact of a question. So, for example, classic project manager question that gets asked all the time by recruiters is, tell me when your last project failed, tell me a little bit about that. Well, my response is, well, I haven't had a project that failed, which is true, because I haven't. Now, that's not to say that I haven't had a project that has changed course. I have. Excuse me. But we have tools as project managers for those. So that question to me is not logical. But what they're actually wanting me to answer is to say something like, well, when I had this project, there was a problem on such and such, and instead of letting it fail, what I did was this, that and the other. And that's what they're actually asking me to do. But when you point blank say to me, tell me about a project that's failed, about one of your projects that's failed, my response is, well, I didn't have one. Okay, so that puts me out of the picture pretty much straight away. Now, also in interviews, there is this thing about eye contact. And a lot of autistic people do not like eye contact. So don't assume if you're an interviewer that just because you're not getting eye contact that there's something wrong with that person. They may just be on the spectrum. I was fortunate never to have that problem because when I was young, and this was way before we knew anything about me being autistic, way back, my father was very aware of this power of looking people in the eye. He was a senior executive himself, and he made sure that that's what I always did. I always looked people in the eye. And what actually has happened over time is that people would often be intimidated by me because even at school, when I was a teenager, I would look the headmistress in the eye if she was talking to me or if she was rousing on me for something because I was always in trouble. I would look her in the eye, and they would often take that in a different way, like I was being contemptuous or disrespectful. But in actual fact, I was just looking them in the eye and listening. And when I do interviews, I tend to do the same thing. So I will stare across the table at the people interviewing me with a very steady gaze and maybe not much expression on my face, which is quite alarming to people quite often. So the STAR method. Now let's talk about the STAR method, because we all know about this situation, task. Let me just have a little look at it again now and see if I can find out what it is. I always forget it, I must say. The action and the response or the outcome. So for everybody else, this works really well. But for somebody like me who's autistic, it doesn't necessarily work. Sure, I can do it, and I have done it in many an interview, but I don't find myself that it really really covers a complex project. And when you're being very logical, like I am, you want to logically think through the issue or the question that they're asking you and give a response in the way that's comfortable for you. So the STAR method, and let me just go over that again because I probably did it wrong before. Situation, task, action, and result, not response. So it can penalise people that have this natural bottom-up processing mechanism that is quite often used by autistic leaders. There's nothing wrong with it, but you can always get into the trap then of being seen as not strategic, which is also not true. For me, I'm far more strategic than I am. I can be tactical, but detail is not my strong suit. So a cognitive way of thinking for an autistic person is that non-linear, data-driven problem solving. Now, what is the evidence? What are you asking me? And then letting your mind or your brain actually work it through by looking at the evidence. So being then asked situation, task, action and result can be a little bit off-putting, but by no means that there's anything wrong with us. Another question that they give me quite often is around a scenario. So give me a scenario, they might ask, when you were in a situation where a person was not happy with what you'd done or one of your team members had done, and how did you deal with it? Might have been a stakeholder or somebody like that. So for me, I would talk about my project management technique. So I would employ my stakeholder management technique. I might look at the RACI, the roles and responsibilities or things like that are very tangible for me. Well, that's not always what the interviewer is after. They are after potentially a more humanistic, emotional type response, and I should be saying something like, well, when that happened, I didn't feel very good about it, and I was upset, so I went off and spoke to a senior manager who helped me to work out how to employ my project management technique. So instead of doing all of that feeling lovely wrapping up in a bow response, I'm seen as cold and rational, which I'm not really. So what I'm going to suggest is that we shift away from this behavioural storytelling that doesn't work for everybody. And I would say not just an autistic person. It just doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody's good at storytelling. And we did something about this in a webinar for the Project Manager Clinic a little while ago about how storytelling can help you in your project management. So another way of doing it might be work sample demonstrations and scenario-based technical simulation. And that sort of goes back to what I was just saying. What are the technical tools that I would use, and then how would I go about it? And you would probably find, if you listen to me go through that process, that I will also identify the human aspects and how I was going to manage that. But very often in an interview, that's not what they want to hear. They want to hear that humanistic part first and then maybe the technical part later. So recruiters, if you're out there, have a little bit more of a think about what you're doing and listening. So the cultural fit stuff. That for an autistic person is an absolute minefield because we know we're not going to fit anywhere anyway. So we can give you examples of how we might fit. We've probably been coached in this cultural fit stuff, but we're not necessarily going to answer that question in the way that you'd like. The other thing to remember about a lot of autistic people too is that we're very much about justice. So if we see an injustice, even if it's happening elsewhere, not to us, we're likely to go into bat to mitigate that injustice. And at times, an autistic person can be used as a weapon by people that understand that that's how we work. So interview for competency rather than this cultural fit stuff. Now, the social norms, like I mentioned before, the dismantling of the eye contact and the social reciprocity as metrics for determining whether somebody is suitable as a manager doesn't work for an autistic person, and particularly a high-functioning autistic person. You can tell us point blank what the issue is. For example, I could say something to someone and they could say to me, well, that didn't really sit well with me, Susanne, the way that you delivered that. And I go, okay, sure. Now, I'm not hurt by that because I know that I can deliver things to people that are not wrapped up in a bow. Doesn't mean that I want to hurt people, doesn't mean I want to upset people. That's just how my mind works. My mind starts to work with what's the observation. Okay, this is happening. What's that person saying? What do they look like? What is their stance? What is their behaviour? This is the evidence. And then I will typically start my talk or my response with the observation. At that point, usually I'm cut off. So I never get to my actual response. So again, think about that if you're interviewing an autistic person. Complex projects, complex situations is where we actually thrive and where we will do very, very well in a job and an interview if you think about that particular way in which we work. So we are very literal, obviously. We have algorithmic thinking. We think in algorithms. That is an actual advantage because we see where all the puzzle pieces fit very, very quickly, but that is often screened out. So there's often a high degree of failure for the autistic leader and even one that's successfully delivered very complex and very large projects like me. So have a think about it. If you're recruiting, if you're an autistic person like me, there are some things that you can learn, a way of responding. Whether you want to or not is up to you. I found that quite often I thought it was just a game I didn't particularly want to play, but we all do what we need to do, unfortunately, often to get a job. So if you're out there and you're listening to this podcast, thank you so much for listening. I hope you subscribe to the podcast and have a bit of a look at the YouTube channel where there's lots of information about project management and how you can implement your project management tools for best advantage. But from me, the Autistic Project Manager, I'm signing off and thank you so much again for listening. Have a great day.